Hi, Misha here, and now with the new camera, kind of thought it might be time to revisit the so-called Century series of U.S. Air Force jet aircraft. And I don't know, I've covered these in individual videos and did kind of a broad overview a while back with most of these, but not all. So, why not revisit, huh? I got some time, maybe you have some time too. Of course, they would start with the North American F-100 Super Sabre. Really, North American's kind of last major development. And then we would get to the F-101 Voodoo. You know, the Super Sabre was used as a fighter and then more extensively fighter bomber. The poor old Voodoo, they had a plane, but its role and use and theoretical use changed a lot. And in the end, its greatest legacy was just that, its legacy, what it would lead to. Not necessarily a bad aircraft, but I don't know, it just seemed to always be a day late and a dollar short in a lot of instances. Next up, we have the F-102A, and this was a dedicated interceptor. It didn't really have any external payload except for fuel tanks. And it was the U.S. Air Force's really first Delta Wing jet that they had high hopes for. But it disappointed quite a bit and took quite a long time to get where it needed to be. Nevertheless, they did produce a good number of them. Next up, we have the F-104 Starfighter. And this one's interesting because this was very much a Lockheed, a Kelly Johnston baby. And the U.S. Air Force really didn't want it. And they would make a lot of these, over 2,500, but fewer than 300 would actually be purchased by the U.S. Air Force. And while it was really best as a air superiority fighter, a dogfighter, they tried using it as a fighter bomber, which, no, that's not what it was there for. However, its engine, the J-79, would go on to be very famous. And of course, this had a lot of foreign service, even though American service was pretty limited. Next up, we have the Republic F-105. This is the D, Thunderchief, commonly called the Thud. This was another in Republic's just big tank-like aircraft with lots of armor and, well, just big. She was originally designed to be a nuclear bomber, but very quickly was reworked to be a more conventional bomber, and was used just as that in Vietnam, as well as a wild weasel, and had a very interesting record in that war. She also could carry quite a good payload, at least for her day and time. Next up, we have another Convair, the F-106A. And if this looks like the F-102A, there's a good reason for this. It started life off as just an improved version, the F-102B, but they made so many changes that it ended up getting its own designation. Not a whole lot of these were produced. In fact, probably the smallest number of any of them here. But they did serve for a decently long period of time. But basically only stateside. They never went to Vietnam. This was the U.S. Air Force's last dedicated Interceptor. The idea was this would be sent up to go at Russian bombers if the need ever arose. And this is them doing their best to get the Convair or Delta Wing right. But it wasn't too much on the scene until this guy came along. This is the F4 Phantom. Or rather, its original Air Force guys, the F-110A Spector. This would kind of be the last in this series before 1962 and the Joint Naming Convention. And it would quickly go from its name in the Air Force to just being known as the F-4C. And then later, of course, the D, the E, and so on and so forth. And this really just outshone the rest with its versatility. It could be a fighter, it could be a bomber, it could even be an interceptor. It could fly from air bases or from aircraft carriers. It really just shaped the world for a long time. And it was a very popular export, as you might imagine. So a lot of success there. But, you know, it has a lot it has to thank these previous designs for, especially the F-101 Voodoo. So with that, we'll just kind of look at each for a few minutes and talk a few interesting factoids. The North American F-100 Super Sabre. Specifically, this is the F-100D variant, which was an improved version and a fighter bomber more than a pure fighter. Around 1951, riding high with the success of the F-86 family, and also that on top of the wild success of the P-51 Mustang, North American was really at the top of their game, and they started wanting to work with a next generation jet, one that should be supersonic. And they went to the new swept-back wing design that had worked so well for the F-86, but they made it bigger, more powerful. And liking what they saw, the Air Force ordered some in 1952. The first prototype flew midway through the next year, and the first production model rolled off the assembly line in late 1953. They started testing it in 54, and they did find some problems at the Air Force. It was a very fast plane for its day and time, but it had issues, including some yawing type things and whatnot. Sorry, I'm trying to dink with the camera a bit. How's that? Is that better? I don't know. I don't know what you're looking at. I have no idea. And even a test pilot was killed. So it had a bit of a rocky start. Nevertheless, the Air Force went ahead and selected it and placed a purchase order, but then it would be grounded the next year through continuing problems, something you're going to hear a lot with various planes in this series early in their production. But then it would finally kind of get into the main thing, and they would be flying them again. But already the early versions, like the 100A and whatnot, they would think about just retiring them and going to new planes. And by 1958, they started pulling them out, and by 61, most of them were out of frontline service. But the Cold War meant that they needed all the planes they can get, so they brought back various units that were flying the Super Sabre. And also in 1956, this version was dreamt up. The D was an improvement. It had a larger wing, larger tail, better payload, improved engine, and it could use the new AIM-9 Sidewinder. And it had a pretty good payload. It's about 50 feet by 39 feet, and had a max speed of about Mach 1.3, and could get up to about 50,000 feet, and could carry just over 7,000 pounds in payload. This is really before guided bombs were a thing, so mostly they were iron bombs or rockets and dispensers. They could also carry nuclear weapons. The F-100C variant was specifically made for that. So, there you go. And these were in Vietnam from the get-go. In fact, the first F-100 to be lost was in 1964, and some of the earliest jet dogfighting in 1965 was with F-100 Super Sabres going up against the newer MiG-17. They would encounter the MiG-21 soon. They were used for a lot of roles. Yeah, they were used for patrol as a fighter. They did still have 4 20mm cannon, so not bad. But more often they were used for close air support for ground troops, attacking targets, bombing targets, and also just other bombing missions like bridges and whatnot. And they were used to escort other aircraft, such as the F-105, when it was used in Vietnam. They even sent some F-100s out as wild weasels, which is a pants-shitting experience for any pilot. Certainly for the adrenaline junkie only. Nevertheless, even though they kind of got the design up and running, and even though it actually served for the longest time in Vietnam, they did start pulling out the early versions, but the Ds would remain all the way through 1971. Production had already ended by 1959, and they would build just under 2,300. And their service would not last much after Vietnam. The main Air Force would retire theirs, then the Air Guard would have theirs for a little longer. But by the mid-late 70s, most of the Super Sabres were retired out. Keeping in mind it was the first supersonic jet, it was fine. I mean, it had good enough performance, all things, once the bugs were worked out. But it wasn't as iconic as North American's previous efforts. But that wasn't really the plane's fault. It just came out at that time and point in history. And so with that, let's look at what came next. Actually, scratch that. Before we move on, I guess I should address the model. This is a 1/72 scale diecast from Hobbymaster. And this is a relatively new release, came out early this year. This is from Vietnam, I think 1965. It's in a bombing configuration with iron bombs and fuel tanks. Typical Hobbymaster features: gears up or down, canopy open close, pilot in out. One neat thing this has, the aerial probe on the side here. It comes with 2 versions. You can plug it in either up or down. It's a good heavy-duty model. My only complaint, and this is with their entire Super Sabre line, the slots in the wings that the ordnance plugs into, while they're very long, they tend to be very shallow. And so the ordnance, especially the big fuel tanks and bigger bombs, easily knock out the 2 inner pylons, which you can either put 4 sidewinders in or 2 bombs. They hold pretty good, but the middle and the outer, I would suggest a dotted glue. Because even newer releases like this, even though they've made it a little better, still not great. But other than that gripe, it's a nice model. But I wish that the ordnance plugged in a little more securely. On the other hand, you do get 2 sets of ordnance with these, so you can configure them to a couple of different mission profiles. Okay, now, for real, let's move on. McDonnell's F-101 Voodoo. This is the 101B 2-seat variant, designed essentially as an Interceptor. The story of this goes all the way back to 1947, when the U.S. Air Force wanted a so-called penetration fighter. It went back and forth a few times. The program was going, then canceled, and then the Korean War it was brought back. And the basic idea originally was it was to be a bomber escort. And then they decided maybe also a bomber escort that could deliver its own payload of nuclear weapons, so on and so forth. Yeah, they didn't really know what they wanted, but they knew they wanted something. And the changing times and technology, the Russians getting the nuke kind of changed the game. And then the whole bomber escort went out the window with the B-52 coming online. Even though the first prototype, well, I shouldn't say prototype, because what they did with this, they essentially awarded McDonnell a contract for a small production batch. Instead of doing prototypes and everything, they just had them build a few planes and they were going to test them. These were ready by 1954, towards the end of the year, but they didn't really have a need. So with the 101A, they decided to make it a nuclear bomber. It could carry a small tactical type nuke and kind of go alongside the main force and what have you. The B came along here as more of an interceptor when the next plane we're going to talk about, the Convair F-102, was a long time in coming. So they looked at the 101 Voodoo's design and decided they could rework it to be an interceptor. And so instead of carrying a nuclear weapon, it has this interesting rotating bomb bay system here with 2 AIM-4 Falcon missiles, one on each side. Because, yeah, it does rotate on this model. I'm just not one to wiggle it off its stand, sorry. So it can carry 2 Falcons, which were designed to shoot down large bombers. As Vietnam taught us, the Falcon was not very good at shooting down aircraft. Fighter aircraft. It also has attachments for tanks. She's a pretty big plane, 69 feet long, give or take, and nearly 40 feet wide, 2 engines, high swept tail, no cannon. The 101C was a strengthened version of the 101A, and probably the most successful really was the RF-101, the reconnaissance. It was used over Cuba in 1962. It also, flying out of Taiwan, was used to take pictures of China and later Vietnam, and was used in Vietnam. In fact, it was the only variant to see active combat throughout that decade. The only foreign user was Canada, and they would build just over 800, with about 475 of those being the 101B variant here. Even though the RF-101 was quite successful for what it was, they had only about 35 built, plus a few conversions. Hobbymaster is going to be doing a RF-101 later, so we'll put a pin in that till whenever that comes out. So essentially, it was used as a tactical bomber for a bit, and used as a interceptor for a bit until the 102 is ready. So it didn't really see a lot of use and influence, and so it started to be phased out in the late 60s and early 70s in the Air Force, and then in the early 80s it was out with the Air Guard, and similarly in Canada it was out by the early 80s. She was relatively fast for her day and time, about Mach 1.7. She had a maximum altitude of 58,000 feet. The Super Sabre before it could only get to about 50,000 feet, and like I said, it was Mach 1.3. The main thing is the plane, they couldn't decide really, and so they tried to make it into different things. But of course, you'll note, this being from McDonnell, the 2-engine layout, the high tail, even the 2-seat cockpit. It obviously kind of foreshadows the later McDonnell Douglas F4 Phantom. Now, even though that was based on a Navy plane, the F3, there's still a design lineage here kind of proving the whole concept. So if nothing else, the Voodoo is pretty neat for its connection to its much more successful little brother. And it's just an integral part of the Century series. Like I said, I can't really say that it was a great success, but it wasn't a failure. It's amazing that it actually went into production considering its original role was deleted. The model here from Hobbymaster is quite impressive and large. Canopy opens. Like I said, the bomb bay does rotate. The drop tanks are removable, gear up or down. It's quite heavy. The only dings against it I can say, the tail, since it's polymer, is a little fragile. And the stand is a little wobbly. Probably best to glue your stand together. That's what I did to mine, just to make sure it wouldn't slip off. I've never had it happen, but there's a first time for everything, right guys? So with that, let's look at what was meant to be the Air Force's Interceptor. Convair's F-102 Delta Dagger. This is the 102A, which pretty much the only one exists. Designed from the outset to be an interceptor, and that's what it was, just never a particularly great one. This actually dates all the way back to around 1948 when they wanted to make the ultimate interceptor aircraft for the Air Force, and they wanted it in service by 1954. It was basically to be defense against bombers, Russian bombers primarily, of course. And so to that end, really the first thing they did was select a fire control mechanism for the weapons, which would be selected and awarded to Hughes in 1950. And once they had chosen that, they decided to figure out an airframe. And originally 3 companies were tasked with making a mock-up. You had Convair, Lockheed, and Republic, but Lockheed and Republic dropped out, leaving Convair. They came up with an airframe to be mated to it, and the first prototype flew in 1953, but it was quickly lost to an accident in just over a week. So the second prototype flew in early 1954, and it too had problems. Namely, they were just very disappointing. They weren't even able to break the sound barrier. They only reached about Mach 0.98, and they just weren't living up to what they were hoped they could be. That's why the 101 Voodoo was tasked with this interceptor role around 1955. But, you know, inertia has a thing, and the project was already under development. So they reworked it. They gave it a new kind of fuselage shape here called a wasp waist. They gave it a more powerful engine. They redesigned the cockpit to be more effective. And originally, these were to carry 24 folding fin rockets, much like the F-86D, the Sabre dog. But soon they would start carrying 6 of the new AIM-4 Falcon missiles designed to shoot down bombers, obviously. No cannon on it, anything like that. So after these improvements and whatnot, in 1956, it was finally introduced into service. What do we have here? Well, she's nearly as big as the Voodoo. It's 68 feet by 38 feet. But she's slower. She is about Mach 1.25, and she has a lower max altitude at 53,000 feet. But she's a cool looking delta wing. And to some extent, she did have a more advanced weapons system, and she could carry more missiles than the Voodoo, just unfortunately they were the Falcon. These were first deployed to Southeast Asia in 1962 and actually would serve in Vietnam until about 1968. They were used for escorting, which kind of what they were originally, had, and they were also used for fighter patrol. And they would eventually build 1,000 of these, so not an insignificant number, but not a grand number. The Air Force would soon take them out of frontline service, with the Air Guard holding on to them until the 1970s. I don't believe there were many, if any, foreign users. I'm not really 100% up on it, but that's what it is. As far as the model here from Hobbymaster, it's actually quite impressive. It is very metal, very heavy. Pretty much all metal. Opening canopy as usual. It's got that interesting profile. And for the weapons bay, you can either plug in a module that has it closed or plug in a module with the doors open, showing the Falcon missiles. And of course, gears up or down. This is definitely a neat effort from Hobbymaster, I have to admit. It's a cool looking plane. They had very high hopes. I mean, heck, the program was called the Ultimate Interceptor, and it just wasn't. I hesitate to call it a failure, but probably of all the ones on the table here, it was the least successful. And they did try to improve it, and succeeded, but like I said in the intro, so much so that they ended up pretty much making a whole new plane. But we'll get to that when we get to that. Next up, we have Lockheed's famous little aircraft. Lockheed F-104 Starfighter. Specifically, this is the 104C, the version for the U.S. Air Force. This definitely is an interesting story. And this is a much smaller aircraft than what we've seen. With the 100, 101, 102, we're getting bigger, heavier. This is a return to a much smaller frame. It's about 55 feet long, so it is relatively long, but under 22 feet wide, and a very light frame to boot. The design here was meant to be simple, small, and high performance. And this was not originally created to fulfill a U.S. Air Force contract. Rather, this was an internal design at Lockheed. In 51, 52, Kelly Johnson and his team were interviewing pilots in Korea, asking them what they wanted, and many replied that they wanted something small, certainly smaller than the F-100 that was under development at the time, and they could go up against a MiG, a dogfighter, so a hot rod, and that's exactly what they designed. They also got wind of a new engine that was being created, the General Motors, the GM J79, a very high performance motor engine with afterburner. So they decided to make an airframe and just wrap it around the engine, and that's pretty much what we have here. We have a giant engine with a bit of a plane wrapped around it. And they went to these interesting wings. They're not a delta wing. It has its own shape, really, and they're very thin. So much so that they really can't hold fuel. Probably barely had enough room to wire for missiles. Anyway, Lockheed took their concept to the Air Force in 52, and the Air Force liked it. They thought, hey, this might be a good eventual replacement for the F-100, the next generation fighter. And so in 53, they announced a competition, kind of using the Lockheed proposal as a base. Other companies did submit proposals, but Lockheed was so much further along, and they pretty much got to call the shots, that they were awarded a contract to build 2 prototypes, and it would receive the designation XF-104. Let's fast forward a bit, not to get bogged down. They did start to fly and test these, but the first ones, they didn't have, the J79 wasn't ready yet, so they had to use an older J65 engine. This just didn't deliver the power. Also, they had trouble with the landing gear, and everything is so tightly packed in to the fuselage. You had the radar at the time, you had the engine, you had the fuel for it, you had the cannon, which just had a brand new M61 cannon. And at the last minute, they decided to make it use the new AIM-9 Sidewinder, which, to be fair, was a lot better than the Falcon. So just a lot of last minute changes. They had to rework the gear, yada yada. Eventually, the F-104A was accepted and squad started to form in 1958. But at this time, the Air Force's attitude had cooled towards it. It, kind of like the F-101 Voodoo, was used as an interim solution until the F-102 could be updated to the F-106. And they first started to try to deploy this as a bomber interceptor, but it wasn't designed for that. It was designed to be a fighter. The main problem is it didn't have range. And it had pretty poor low speed performance. And it had pretty meh maneuverability. So what makes this a great aircraft? It was fast as hell. For that day and time, it was the Air Force's first Mach 2 plane. Some versions could get up to about Mach 2.2, and probably could have gone even faster, except they hit the limitations of the metallurgy of the day. Heat buildup, airframe stresses, so on and so forth. She settled in. Her best speed was about Mach 1.4. So she was a supersonic plane through and through. Her max altitude was about 50,000 feet, although some sources claim it was quite a bit higher. And she had a very high landing speed, and it took a skilled pilot to manage her, but once it could really make it sing. But yeah, the Air Force tried employing it as a interceptor. It just didn't have the fuel and range for this, so they cut their order down. And they even were kind of starting to pull these out of service, at least front line. But then the Berlin crisis happened, the Berlin Law crisis, 61-62, so they had to kind of refill them again. They also developed this version here, the C, to try to make it a fighter-bomber. Okay, it wasn't a good interceptor. Let's try to make it a fighter-bomber. And not a good idea, but okay. They added aerial refueling capability. They also added additional hard points under the fuselage. It could carry conventional bombs or a nuclear tactical bomb. And again, it wasn't really great for this, but you know, hey, so be it. So you had the A's and the C's. The B was a 2-seat trainer, as was the D. Ultimately, the Air Force would purchase fewer than 300. However, globally, it was a huge success, or at least a good success. They would, I should say, not just Lockheed alone, but nearly 2,600 Starfighters would be produced before it was said and done, and they were very much used in places like West Germany, Italy, Japan, Taiwan, and so on and so forth. The U.S. did deploy these in Vietnam. Their first tour of duty was in 1965. They were used as kind of bomber escort and to draw out anti-aircraft installations on the ground using their speed. And yeah, to some extent they tried to use them as an ad hoc bomber, but not often. Their first tour wasn't great. In fact, a few were lost and were not able to really show any MiG kills for it. They were never really employed properly as a dogfighter. But they did have another tour of duty from the summer of 66 to the summer of 67, and again, not really that great. In fact, I think 14 were lost to various causes. And after this, they're pretty much pulled out and retired because they didn't have that many to operate to begin with. The F-106 was finally on the scene to be an interceptor. And for fighter bombers, they had much better options. The F-100D, the F-105, and of course the new F-4. So the history in the American Air Force was pretty limited, but still one of the coolest fighters. And of course the J-79 engine this was based around would go on. And it's worth pointing out that the engine itself really cut its teeth on this plane. They had engine troubles throughout at least the early years of the Starfighter's career, as well as trouble with the M61 cannon, specifically its shells ejecting. But both of these, after design revisions, would go on to be tried and tested parts of the U.S. War machine. As would our next aircraft, the Thud. The Republic F-105 Thunderchief. This is the 105D variant, most common in Vietnam, and known as the Thud. Just an apt nickname. When this went into service, it was the heaviest single-seat, single-engine military fighter in the world. And it really was an interesting aircraft, and actually quite successful. It dated back to the Korean War, when the Republic, who had been known for designing large, heavily armored, durable fighter bomber aircraft since World War II, with like the P-47 and the F-84 of Korean fame, this was what they thought would be a good replacement. And they showed it to the Air Force, and they agreed. And this was around the same time, 1952, as the 104 in Lockheed. But totally different roles, two different concepts. And so they would work on the design, and their main competition was from North American, who was creating an updated version of their F-100 Super Sabre to be more of a dedicated fighter bomber, different from the F-100D. And for a time, they were kind of running head-to-head. The first prototype of this would fly in 1955, and had far less development troubles. Though they did revise it some in 56. They started to go to the wasp waist thing here, like that has proven popular. They updated the cockpit, gave it a better gun sight, and so on and so forth, plastering on more armor with different versions. By this time, the North American competition was known as the F-107, and it looked like that it would probably be the winner of the competition. So it surprised a lot of people when the Republic design was selected in 1957 and ordered into production, and started to be delivered in 1959. This is a large aircraft. She is about 65 feet by 35 feet, heavy too, thick. And originally she had an internal bomb bay which could carry a nuclear weapon. She also had 5 external hardpoints, 4 under the wings. She had a cannon. It was a M61A1 with over 1,000 rounds. And she had this interesting engine that could open up like a flower or close in. And you'd think a plane like this might be slow, but far from it. Republic designed her to be fast and able to operate at low altitudes for precision strikes. She could go above a Mach 2, not quite 2.1, but safely over 2. She had a bit of a low max ceiling at about 48,000 feet, though. Still plenty fine. Again, she was designed for low altitude. That was just, her thing. But maybe quite impressively for the time, she could carry about 14,000 pounds in payload and ordnance, which was more than the World War II B-17 and twice that of the F-100 Super Sabre. She also had early warning equipment, radar. She was one of the first planes to get away from dials, gauges in the cockpit and go to kind of tape display, which would, be eclipsed by digital displays later, but this was felt to be better. And she was just durable, and she had good range too, and could carry external fuel tanks. Nevertheless, her orders were cut short in 1961 as the next generation of aircraft were coming online, such as the F-4 Phantom. But they were allowed to fulfill their contracts with the final aircraft rolling off the assembly line in 1964, and they built just over 830. The 105D was kind of the ultimate single-seat strike bomber variant with many improvements. The 105G was a two-seat Wild Weasel variant, which Hobbymaster is coming out with, hopefully. It's been delayed several times, but that'll be neat if it does come out soon. And just as the last one was rolling off the production line, these would go to Vietnam in August of '64, and would be pretty much the most heavily used strike fighter bomber early in the war. Their heavy payload, fast speed, would be taken advantage of to hit critical targets, ammo dumps, camps, again, bridges, trails, formations, and they did well, and their armor definitely helped. These could take a beating. They really could. But the attrition rate was also very high. The U.S. Air Force would lose nearly 400 in Vietnam, over 300 to enemy action. And this was a bit of a point of contention with some in the government. This was supposed to be the newest, bestest, cutting-edge fighter jet, and it was sometimes being shot down by older MiGs, not just 21s, but maybe even 17s. This was not a fighter, even though it had a cannon, and very rarely would have much in the way of anti-aircraft offense, sometimes having sidewinders, but usually these were loaded up with bombs and fuel for range. Therefore, by 1969, 1970, these were being pulled out of service in Vietnam and replaced with the F-4 and a few other newer planes, and would go home. And the main active Air Force would retire these by 1973, 74, and the Air Guard would continue to fly them to about 1984 because they didn't break. Early on, a lot of these other aircraft we've talked about here had teething problems. I'm not going to say that the Thud was perfect, but really the biggest problem they had early in service was just lack of parts and planes. But the planes themselves were holding up quite well. Speaking of that, this Hobbymaster model is a chunkster. Very big model. Very heavy. And it has something that I wish they did more often. It comes with two fuel tanks, one with a hole in it for the stand and one without. I wish more Hobbymasters let you keep your center line ordnance. A lot of them you have to decide if you want it or the stand. And it does come with both engine nozzles, open or closed, you can display it with. So that is neat. It is really heavy. It definitely feels like a Thud. Also, the stand has a metal stem. It's probably one of my favorites of all of these. It's just an iconic iconic aircraft from that period. It is indeed. You know, losing the contract for this, the F-107 not making it, is one of the key things that spelled the downturn in North Americans' fortunes. And Republic would go on to make other ground attack and fighter bomber type aircraft. That's just kind of their MO, what they were good at. And let's get away from the ground and kind of get back to the Interceptor. So back to the F-102A Delta Dagger. Like I said, they were working on an improved version, originally to be the F-102B. In 1955, this concept was shown off to the Air Force, and they approved it. So Convair got to work on it, and it really was a pretty big jump. They went to a new wing and a new tail layout, at least an updated one. They went to a new engine. They went to a new cockpit, several other little mechanical changes and what have you. And so much was changed that they redesignated it in 1956 the F-106A Delta Dart, sometimes known as the 6. And so they got the prototype ready to go at the very end of 1956 and started really testing it in 57. And again, it was quite disappointing. It didn't have the speed and everything else they wanted. I think at this point it's pretty clear the design, it just wasn't coming together. And they really threatened to just cancel it altogether. But finally they made enough changes and kept tinkering with it that it was acceptable in 1959 and did start to go into production and service. The Air Force would order 350 and they would end up building just 342 of these. They were never exported to anyone. And while they actually would remain in service till the 1980s, they never really were deployed overseas much of anywhere, never went to Vietnam. They pretty much just hung around the USA because, like the F-102, this was meant to be a dedicated interceptor. In fact, it was the Air Force's last dedicated interceptor. So, what exactly did the improved Delta give them? Well, she's a long aircraft at 71 feet and about 38 feet wide, and she has about the longest pitot tube I've ever seen. It is crazy. And she was fast, quite a bit faster than her Forerunner at Mach 2.3. So far the fastest one we've really talked about. And she had a pretty good max altitude of about 57,000 feet, give or take. And like the 102, she has the internal bay that can open up to release Falcon missiles. One nuclear element I haven't mentioned that the Air Force was deploying for a time were the Genie nuclear-tipped rockets, which is about the most 50s thing I can think of, combining rocket and nuclear, and then naming it Genie. Not exactly a very successful design, but it could carry them as well. Originally, she did not have a cannon, but in 1972, Project 6-Shooter would equip quite a few of these Delta darts with an M61A1 cannon, and I believe it was 650 rounds of ammunition. When they did this, they gave them a new gun sight and reworked the canopy to take away some of the metal framing, give the pilot a better unobstructed view. And so that did update these a wee bit. This was kind of at the time, in Vietnam, with the Phantom was really showing the value of that. Anyway, by 1981, these started to be replaced by the F-15 Eagle. And in 1988, they were pretty much all out of Air Force and Air Guard service. Some of them were actually used as drone targets, too. So that's fun. And again, these were never exported to allies. Last, definitely not least, and not really a member of the Century series, we get to the F-4 Phantom, or as it was initially known in 61 and 62 to the Air Force, the McDonnell Douglas F-110A Spector. But that name would quickly be dropped when the whole Joint Services naming convention thing came online, but for a brief time. And the early ones were just borrowed F-4Bs from the Navy. And I'm not going to talk much about this, but this really did. This was one of the few times that kind of one-size-fits-all worked. She was fast at Mach 2.2. She had good altitude at least 60,000 feet. She could carry a good payload of over 18,000 pounds. She had 2 engines for dependability, had 2 seats. Originally, she didn't have a cannon, but of course, with the F-4E model, they would rectify this with the internal M61 cannon. Before that, she sometimes used an external pod. She could fire air-to-air missiles. She could drop gump bombs. She worked well as a fighter, and she worked great as a fighter-bomber. She also worked good as a reconnaissance plane. The RF-4C and eventually RF-4E would replace a lot of the older recon planes. And this is why over 5,000 Phantoms were made. Now, not all of these went to the U.S. military, U.S. Air Force, but a large majority did. And this would be what would dominate the Air Force in Vietnam starting around 1966. They would originally deploy these in the Air Force with the Falcon missile, much as they used on other planes, but it was not very successful at all. But soon they would wire them for the Sidewinder, and then they would have some pretty good success, to say the least. Well, I'm not going to say the F-4 was perfect, far from it. It was a very good plane, and allowed them to retire a lot of others and standardize and whatnot. One of the times that did work out in their favor. But yeah, I've done plenty of videos on the Phantom, so check out those for more. I just wanted to mention it here because this kind of caps everything, showing why a lot of these other planes had limited service after she came onto the scene. Well, let's have a few final thoughts. Alright, and we've made it through. The idea here was just to kind of contextualize the evolution of the Century series from F-100 to F-10. Of course, there were other models that never went into production, like the F-103 and the F-107. But these are the ones that did. And you can definitely see, some were meant to be one thing and became another. Some were meant to be bombers and interceptors, fighters. And, it's interesting that they all kind of trace back to the 50s and were coming into service late 50s, early 60s. And many of them lasted through the early 70s front line and then maybe late 70s to early 80s second line reserve type. And really the only ones to achieve any, export, foreign success, foreign sales, would have been the F-104 and the F-4. The rest were pretty much exclusive to the U.S. Air Force and maybe a couple of allies like Canada. But it's really neat to see the progression. And that was the time of rapid technological evolution of both the hardware, the weapons, and even the early computers and readouts and all of that. But of course, once you get to the F4, things do kind of calm down a bit. Technology, I'm not going to say stagnates, it certainly didn't. You know, we had a lot of great aircraft come out after F-15, F-14, F-16, F-A-18. But at least with the F-4 here, you had a very competent aircraft that was modern enough to have some staying power. These others, while they were great for their day, technology just eclipsed them so quickly. And that was just the 1950s, especially with jet engines and guided air-to-air missiles. I mean, the Falcon to the Sidewinder. And now that we've kind of hit on the Sidewinder, we've got something that works very well. Anyway, it wasn't meant to be a full historical overview of each of these, otherwise this would be a 3-hour video, but just a little bit. I do have some older videos, if you want to check those out. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. And when the new Hobby Master models come out, I'm sure I'll do an update video at that time. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.